Okay, so in this video, we're going to be taking a look at variable scope. So a variable scope is going to be the part of the program that has access to that variable. The variable scope is going to be dependent on precisely where you've declared the variable in your program. It's important to keep in mind that in order to actually use a variable, you need to make sure that it has already been declared first. So you can see an example here where we assume that we've got this print statement, and inside of that we want to try to print out value, but we have not yet declared what value is, maybe what its data type is, or values inside of it, until the next line after that. So an important thing to keep in mind about your programs is that primarily they're going to be read from top to bottom. We're going to consider a couple of exceptions a little bit later on, but for the most part, they go in this order from top to bottom. So if you hit a certain line where you're trying to use a variable, but there was no line before that that tells the program what that variable is or what it's supposed to do, then we're going to have an error. So it's not going to recognize what the purpose of that variable is. So the compiler will not understand what the value is yet, and that's how you're going to get this error. Another way to describe your programs is kind of like a set of directions. Pretty useful analogy here would be a recipe for cooking. If you've not yet specified certain ingredients for your recipe, it's going to be difficult to understand what it is that you mean when you mention those ingredients somewhere in the actual directions for whatever it is that you're cooking. So I'm going to go ahead and create a simple project in NetBeans. I'll tell you now, if you have primarily been trying to follow along with the programs, you've been trying to create these with me, I will suggest that you don't worry about trying to make this one. The code is going to be very short, and it's also going to be filled with errors, so it's not even going to work anyway. I'm primarily just going to be doing this to show those different errors that you can get. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Java application. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and call this scope demo.java. And for this one, I'll go ahead and remove all the extra comments and get this all cleaned up at least. So the intent of this one is going to be to just demonstrate a couple of the different mistakes or errors that we can run into when we are dealing with variable scope. So the first one we saw was if we try to access something or use something that we've not yet declared, say like value. Naturally, in this context, we have not declared value anywhere in this program, so it only makes sense that when the program sees this, it doesn't really know what that means. But of course, if we try to do this after the print statement, say something kind of like this, even in this case, it still doesn't understand what value is because of the fact that value is not declared until after encountering that print statement. So it's going to see this line right here, and it's going to try to execute it or perform whatever task that line of code is requesting. But this print statement is trying to use value, which has not actually been set up to be used until line 9 right here. So right here, it just doesn't make any sense. It can't do anything with it yet. So the correct thing to do here is just make sure that these are in the proper order. So you'd want to go ahead and move this so that you actually declare it first and then use it later. So that's the general rule here, is to make sure that you've declared a variable before you try to use it somewhere. In addition to that, there's another characteristic about variable names you need to be careful about, which is that they're going to be limited based on the scope that you're currently in, meaning that no two variables can have the same name in the same scope. And the reasoning for this is pretty straightforward. How exactly would you be able to tell the difference? If you create two variables that have the same name, how do you know which one you're referring to whenever you try to use it later? Or to refer back to the box analogy, imagine that you have two boxes and you've put the same label on those two boxes. Well, if somebody asks you for one of those boxes later, how do you know which one that they are referring to? So in this case, we've got two instances where we're trying to declare an integer called number. We give it two different values, so we got 10 and 20. And then when we get to this print statement, we're trying to print out number, but do you mean that you want to print out the number 10 or the number 20? So if you try to do something like this, the warning that Java is going to give you is going to be the second time that you try to declare a variable called number. So it's actually going to be that second line where you get the error. So if we take a quick look at this, so I use this as an example. So we saw a number in the slides. We'll go ahead and just use value here. So we have another int called value. This is equal to 200. And if you try to do this, it will give you the error right here. And if you check it, it will give you this error variable value is already defined in your main method. So it gives you this warning. And the name for this particular problem, this particular issue, this is known as a naming collision. So you say that these two names are colliding with one another, meaning that you don't necessarily know which one you intend to use. To resolve this issue, you need to make sure that either all of your variable names are distinct, so each one of them needs to be different from any of the others, or your variables that have the same name need to be placed into different scopes. So right now we're only working with the scope of the main method. Eventually we're going to introduce a couple of other instances where we can have different scopes, say different scopes within the main method or different scopes outside of the main method. Eventually we'll also get to a point where we'll look at scopes that are in different files as well. So for now we'll focus just on the main method, and the main things to keep in mind are making sure that you don't have any naming collisions and that you've made sure that your variables are declared before you actually use them. So this will cover everything for scope for now. In the next video, we're going to take a look at a couple of things that are not really affected by, or that don't affect the compilation or the running of your programs, but are really more for your own sake as a programmer. Those are going to be comments and program styling.